Shalom, my dear friends. Shalom from the holy city of Jerusalem, Yerushalayim, Ir HaKodesh. Today, the sixth day of the month of Elul of the year 5777, corresponding to the 28th of August of the year 2017. And welcome back to our continuing studies now in Hebrew Bible, prophecy and wisdom in the Song of Songs, studying also the forms of the letters of Aleph Bet as they're written in the Holy Torah scroll and in the mezuzah and in the tefillin, and studying teachings of Rabbi Nachman from Likutei Moharan, and now on the theme of the hidden light. So let us now, with the help of God, turn to our studies of Shir HaShirim, Song of Songs. And we are beginning at the beginning. Shalom, today, the sixth day of the month of Elul of the year 5777, corresponding to the 28th of August of the year 2017. And we today commence our study of the Hebrew text of the Song of Songs. Just before we commence with the actual text of Shir HaShirim, let us come into some introductory comments about the remarkable text that we have here. And no better place to start than the introductions given by our great commentators, the classical commentators on the Tanakh. And particularly today, in this introduction to the text, I would like to study the teachings of three of our Meforshim, the first being Rashi, Rabbeinu Shlomo Yitzchaki, the famous Rashi commentator on all of five books of Moses, Tanakh, Talmud, and with his commentary on Shir HaShirim. We also have on Shir HaShirim the commentary known as the Metzudot, the Towers, the twin commentary consisting of explanations of the meanings of the words, one of the towers and the other being the explanation of the meaning and the implications of the text by Rabbi Yechiel Hillel from Yabrov, living in the 1700s. And the third that I might like to mention today is the very famous Rabbi Avraham Ibn Ezra, one of the medieval commentators some century and a half after Rashi. And let us in fact start with the words of the Ibn Ezra on our text, the Song of Songs. He says, "This noble work, which is all delights, there's not at all anything like it in all of the songs of King Solomon, the 5 and 1,000 that are mentioned in the book of Proverbs, nothing like this." And that is why the opening words are Shir HaShirim Asher Shlomo, the song of songs that are to Shlomo. Here the Ibn Ezra looking at the simple meaning of the Hebrew words that open scroll of Song of Songs, the song of all the songs that Solomon wrote, because this song, says Ibn Ezra, is more exalted above all of the other songs that were written by Shlomo. And its secret is deeply closed up and sealed, because it begins alluding to the days of Abraham, our father, and going all the way to the days of Moshiach. And likewise in Moses' concluding song in Deuteronomy chapter 32, Ha'azinu, it goes from the time when the Supreme distributed the lands as an inheritance among all the nations, and started thereby from the generation of the separations of the nations, namely from the time of the Tower of Babel, all the way to the return of Israel from the exile after the war of Gog and Magog. And do not be surprised, says Ibn Ezra, that the Song of Songs compares the Knesset Yisrael, the assembly of Israel, that is the true people of Israel, the true souls of Israel, to a bride, and that God is compared to her beloved. Because this is the way of the prophets. Isaiah in chapter 5 speaks about the song of my beloved over his vineyard. And he also speaks about how the restoration of reconciliation between God and Israel is compared to that of a bridegroom and his bride. Likewise, Ezekiel in chapter 16, in verse 7, he compares Israel to a maiden whose breasts have formed and her hair is beginning to sprout, and there you were, says Ezekiel of Israel, you were naked and bare in Egypt. And likewise, the verse later on in the same chapter, Ezekiel chapter 16, verse 11, says how God covered over Israel's nakedness, namely comparing Israel to a maiden, and he adorned her with adornments. And so that whole chapter in Ezekiel chapter 16 all speaks about Israel compared to a maiden. And the prophet Hosea also in chapter 2 of Hosea, he says, God says to Israel, I have betrothed you to me forever. And likewise in Hosea chapter 3, he says, go love a woman, in the mashal, the parable of the wife that Hosea was to marry. Likewise in Psalms chapter 45, verse 1, it speaks about the wise song of Yedidut, of love. And there it speaks about God, the speaker, which is God, addressing Israel. Hear, my daughter, see and incline your ear. And emphasizes now Rabbi Avraham ibn Ezra. He says, God forbid that Song of Songs should be seen as simply words of desire, like a kind of romance. But the whole thing is a mashal, it is all a parable. And were it not for the greatness of the level of Shir Hashirim, would never have been written in the canon of the writings of our Tanakh. And there is absolutely no machloket, no longer any division of opinion among our sages that a scroll of Shir Hashirim would indeed defile the hands of the person handling it ritually, such as to make those hands then put impurity upon any food they would touch, and that is the qualification for a scroll being included in the canon of the Tanakh, as we saw in our introduction yesterday. And that is how Ibn Ezra introduces Shir Hashirim. And let us now turn to the introduction of the Baal HaMetzudas, the writer of the Twin Towers of the Metzudat David and Metzudat Tziyun by Rabbi Yechiel Hillel of Yabrov, who lived in the second half of the 18th century, and who is therefore one of the more modern of our commentators, although not as recent as Malbim, but nevertheless relatively recent, and therefore it's mentioned that his commentary has the Haskama of Rabbi Chaim Yosef David Azulai, known as the Chida, one of the outstanding sages that lived in the from 1724 through to 1806, and saw the greatness of this commentary. Here is the introduction of the Baal HaMetzudas, Rabbi Yechiel Hillel of Yabrov, on Song of Songs. He says, many people have put their eye to examine this scroll of Song of Songs and to explain it in one way or another, one direction or another. Each and every person, according to the labor, the different commentators that have commented on this work. However, he says, all of those who sought the actual pshat, the straightforward, simple meaning, clear meaning of the text, have not found a destination of tranquility. And so far they have not felt satisfied with all of these existing commentaries, because some of those commentaries go very, very far from the way of our sages. Some of them go far away from the classic midrashim of the Talmud and the commentary of Rashi. Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, who is the father of all of the commentators, whose introduction to Shir HaShirim we shall hear presently, continues the Baal HaMetzudas. He says all of these different commentaries have directed people in a different direction, and nobody has succeeded in binding together all of the verses to make one great whole, where each part is tightly attached to the other with a narrow seal with no gap between the parts. Here he's quoting a verse we had in the book of Job at the end, in God's evocation of the Leviathan, how the scales of Leviathan are literally touching one to the other so tightly that nothing can come between them. And he wants to say here that people have sought in vain for a commentary that will show how everything is attached together as one whole. And some of those commentators, he said, have ignored either the meaning of the mashal, the parable of Shir HaShirim, or the nimshal, the moral of the parable, the meaning of the parable, what the parable is referring to. And these two terms are indispensable for our understanding of all of our commentators and for approaching Shir HaShirim. We have on the one hand the mashal, the outer parable of the lover and the beloved, but we have the inner nimshal, that which is the meaning of the parable, which is the Holy One, blessed be He, and Israel. And he says that some have gone in exploring the mashal, others the nimshal, but nobody has been able to join everything together into one whole. And therefore, he says, for this purpose I have stood up out of all of my companions here, and I have followed in the footsteps of the commentary that, with praise to God, I've already been able to develop and to bring to fruition over the early and the later prophecies and the holy writings. And indeed, we have seen in our studies of the book of Job the genius of the Baal HaMetzudas in explaining to us the meaning of those very obscure passages in Job. And he's referring now to the other parts of his commentary on Nevi'im and Ketuvim, which had already come out before his commentary on Shir HaShirim, according to this. And he says he's following in the pathway of that commentary of the Metzudas, which have already, he writes, been scattered through the world and have found favor in the eyes of all. And he says, I have gathered the fine flower out of all of the words of the different commentators that have already been written and printed, and many manuscripts. And he says, everything precious my eye has seen. And here and there, he says, where necessary, I have added additional comments of my own in order that the commentary should be a vessel fitted for its work, namely to help us to understand this holy work of Shir HaShirim. And he says, here too I have divided my commentary into two parts. One, which is the Metzudat Tzion, contains the roots of all of the words where there is some doubt as to their meaning, and the necessary witnesses from other parts of Tanakh to the actual meaning of the word is used here. This is called the Metzudat Tzion, the Tower of Zion. And the second part of the commentary is the explanation of the actual meaning of the text under the title of Metzudat David. And he says this Megillah, this scroll, compares the love of Knesset Israel. Again, the same theme as we had in Ibn Ezra. Compares the love of Knesset Israel with the Holy One, blessed be He, to the love between the beloved and a lover, where the beloved is longing and yearning for him after he has been separated from her. And he too, he does not move from his love for her, even though he is away, but he promises to return to her and to live with her, to dwell with her, just like then in the time of the flourishing of the first marriage, as shall be explained in the verses one by one. And he says all the time in his commentary, he will indeed divide his explanation into the explanation of the mashal, the parable of the lover and his beloved, and then explain the nimshal, what the elements of the parable in the particular verse are referring to, in order that all should be pleasing to the taste of the mouth, the palate, who will taste and will set one's footsteps on the path, and may the Lord our God be with the student of this work. So that is the Hakdama of the Metzudat Bala Metzudas, Rabbi Yechiel Hillel of Yabrov, and we see again the same basic kav, the same line as we saw in the introduction of the Rabbi Avram ibn Ezra, as to the meaning of the mashal being the relationship between God and the chosen people. And here again we will see the same in the introductory words of Rashi on our text. Rashi, in his Hakdama, his introduction, he says, quoting Psalms 62 verse 12, he says, Achas diber Elohim, shtaim zu shomati. Achas diber Elohim, one thing God spoke, shtaim zu shomati, two is this that I heard. That is to say, explains Rashi, one and the same verse may go forth to many different meanings and reasons, but at the end of the matter, you have no verse that goes out from its simple meaning, pshuto umashma'o. Two Hebrew words, pshuto, the pashut, the simple meaning that it has, and mashmo'o, what it is saying to the ear. We cannot twist the verse and depart from the straightforward meaning, even though we may darshan that the straightforward meaning refers to the elements of the nimshal, but we cannot allow the nimshal, our interpretation of the meaning of the verses, to depart from the interpretation of the verses to depart from their straightforward meaning. Everything has to fit together. All of the levels of Torah interpretation, the high levels of Sod, the secret level, the Drush, the elusive level, the homiletical level, the level of hermeneutics, the remez, again the allusions, and the pshat. All those four levels have to go all in a straight line, a straight column. They have to be joined together. You cannot have one departing from the other. And continues Rashi, even though the prophets spoke their words in dugma. Now here Rashi is using the Hebrew word dugma, which in contemporary Hebrew means an example, a particular case. So here he's using this word and the same word as the other two commentaries we've looked at. The Ibn Ezra and the Bala Mitzudas are using the expression mashal. It's one of the same idea. Rashi is using this term dugma in his introduction in the same way as mashal, the parable. When all of our prophets, he says, spoke with the dugma in parables. And it is necessary to settle the meaning of the parable according to the particular content of the parable. Rashi is using an expression derived from Book of Proverbs on its wheels. In other words, the parable has its own emotion, its own dynamics, and we have to explain and understand the parable according to all of its elements, just as the verses are ordered in our text one after the other. And says Rashi, now entering a little complaint against some of the midrashim I've seen on Book of Songs, Song of Songs, many midrashei agadah, many allegorical and homiletical interpretations, some of which are collected all into one single work of midrash. We do have midrash Shir HaShirim and other collections specifically devoted to Shir HaShirim, but there are other interpretations which are scattered all over the different works of Midrash that we have come down to us from our sages, but not all of them can be related exactly to the specific text that we have in front of us and to the order of the verses. And therefore, says Rashi, Omarti belibi, I've said in my heart to go after, to take hold of the straightforward mashma'ut, the straightforward meaning of the verses, in order to settle and order the explanation of the verses in a proper order. And then I will attach to these explanations some of the midrashim of our sages, each and every midrash in its proper place in the course of the verses on Shir HaShirim. And now coming Rashi to explain the general intent of Shir HaShirim. He says, V'omer ani, I say, Rashi says that Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon, saw with Holy Spirit that Israel were destined to go into exile, one exile after the other. Of course, King Solomon was at the very peak of the glory of Israel at the just after his illustrious father David HaMelech, also an outstanding singer, Ne'im Zmirot Yisrael, the sweet singer of Israel. King Solomon presiding over the great empire across the Middle East from the river to the river. Nevertheless, King Solomon in his Holy Spirit, he saw that Israel were destined to go into one exile after the other, one destruction after another, and to moan and mourn in this exile over their first glory, and to remember the first love, that Israel were a precious treasure to the Almighty out of all of the nations. And this would bring Israel in the exile to say, let me go back and return to my first man, my first husband. For it was better for me then than now. These are the words of Hosea chapter 2, verse 9. Let me go back to my first man. And they would remember God's kindnesses, and they would also be aware of the treachery that they had shown to the Almighty. And they would remember all of the good things that He had promised to give them at the end of days. And King Solomon therefore established this sefer, this work, through his Ruach HaKodesh, through his Holy Spirit, using the language of a woman that is tzrura, Almanus chayos, that is to say, tzrura, she's bound up, she's trapped. Almanus chayos, she is like a living widow, even though her husband is there and alive, she is as a widow. Mishtoikekes al balo, she is longing for her husband. She's trying to entreat him to snuggle up to her beloved, remembering the love of her youth for him and acknowledging her transgressions. And likewise, her beloved is troubled by her trouble and pain and remembers the kindnesses of her youth and her beauty, her beautiful appearance, and the beauty and the purity of her deeds, through which he was bound with her with the most strong love, to let her know that it was not his intention to torment her, and that her divorce is no divorce. She was never sent away, for he is still her husband and she his wife, and he is destined to return to her. A very beautiful evocation by Rashi of the meaning of this mashal, of this beautiful love story. We see in Shir HaShirim such a beautiful world of hills and streams and fountains, of doves and pigeons, of sheep and goats, of flowers and fruits and fragrant scents, perfumes. We see a love story that is set in the Holy Land of Israel that makes reference to Yerushalayim, to Tzion, and also to the surrounding areas, to Mitzrayim, Egypt, Damascus. There's reference to Lebanon, the Lebanon, which is actually a reference to the Temple Mount, and many, many allusions. We have Ein Gedi, the beautiful, enchanting area of the at the western hills, running down to the Yam HaMelach, the Salt Sea, so-called the Dead Sea in Israel, the Yam HaMelach, the Salt Sea. We see so many beautiful evocations of the land of Israel in such a place of innocence. This is a pastoral world where the lover is a shepherd and the beloved also is tending the flocks, and they're visiting the karamim, the orchards, and they're scenting the banks of herbs, fragrant herbs, and they're going to look at the budding grapes. All of the fruits with which the land of Israel is praised are mentioned in this work: the wheat, the grain, the grapes and the wine and the figs and the dates, the date palm and the pomegranate, all in this lovely pastoral lyric. And it is indeed the simple pshat, the simple meaning, direct meaning of the text is so very, very beautiful if we will understand who is speaking and who is addressing who. Well, there are really three parties in the three interlocutors in this love lyric. There is the chashukah, the beloved. There is the choshek, the lover, and there is, as it were, an audience of the daughters of Jerusalem who are also joining in. At times they are being addressed, and they are sometimes addressing the beloved, and the beloved is all the time longing for her lover. And this is the outer mashal of this work. And to conclude now our study for today, I would simply like to chant some of the opening verses of Shir HaShirim to see how actually the cantillation of Shir Hashirim is indeed a cantillation suggestive of the musings of one who's truly love-sick, truly enchanted by love. Shir Hashirim asher li Shlomo yishokeni mineshikos pihu ki tovim dodecho miyoyin lereach shomonecho toivim shemen turak shemecho al kein alomois haevucho moshcheni acharecho norutzo heviani hamelech chadoro nogilo v'nismechovoch naskiro dodechi umeyayin meishorim ahevucho da 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 da. It's love musing, and we will, in our coming sessions, with God's help, have the zechut to enter into the mysteries and the beautiful nimshal of this work. So with that, my dear friends, we will now take a break for just a few moments and then come shortly to our studies of the Hebrew letters for today. Shalom again, my dear friends. And before we continue, of course, our thoughts and our prayers are with the people of Texas suffering from the ravages of the hurricane and the flooding. Our thoughts are with all of those who are suffering, who have been made homeless, who have lost property, have lost beloved ones and possessions. Our prayers are for you, for the residents of the entire area that has been affected by the flooding and the ravages. Our prayers are for you and for the welfare of a state that is a powerful pillar of what is represented by our true civilization. Our prayers are for you, the people of Texas. With that, let us now proceed to the next section of our studies, now our study of the forms of the Hebrew letters. Shalom, today, the 6th day of the month of Elul of the year 5777, corresponding to the 28th of August of the year 2017. And today we commence the study of the laws of the forms of the Hebrew letters as they are written in the Torah scroll and in the tefillin, the phylacteries of the head and the arm, which are bound by Jewish males on weekdays, and in the mezuzot, the scrolls of Shema Yisrael and the second paragraph, V'hoyo im Shemoah, 3 ritual items, all of which carry kedusha, holiness, and we should be looking in the coming sessions at the forms of the letters as prescribed by tradition, brought down by Rabbi Yosef Karo, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, together with the views of Rabbi Yitzhak Luria, the Arizal, on the Kabbalistic forms of some of the letters, which differ slightly from the way that they are written according to the tradition of what is known as Ktav Bet Yosef, the script of Bet Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Karo, that is according to the laws brought down by Rabbi Yosef Karo. And we should be studying all of these laws on the basis of a text known as Mishnas Sofrim, the Mishnah, the repeated law of the scribes. That is the laws that have been collected by Rabbi Yisrael Kagan, the outstanding halachic authority of the previous generation, used until today in his best-known work, Mishnah Berurah, his halachic work on the first part of Shulchan Aruch Orach Chaim, on the daily prayers and tefillin and tzitzit and the Shabbat and festivals. And in this work, Mishnat Sofrim, the Chafetz Chaim, the author of Mishnah Berurah, has set down the bottom line of the psak halacha, the decision of the halacha as to how the letters are to be written according to these 2 traditions, that of Bet Yosef and that of Arizal. And today we shall start with the letter Aleph, and let me point out that on a Zamra website, on the page of the site that gives you access to the live video class, if you'll scroll down the page, you have a number of resources that are designed to help those who are studying now with us the forms of the Hebrew letters. And since our previous session, I've added a new source there. If you look at the online text for current classes, besides the translation of Shir Hashirim and the audio cantillation of Song of Songs, we have a link that says Hebrew alphabet used in writing Torah scroll, tefillin, and mezuzot. This is a PDF that gives a simple digest of the basic laws relating to the letters, together with illustrations. Beneath that is a link to Mishnat Sofrim. That is the work that we shall be using in this course to examine the forms of the letters. This is the work written by Chafetz Chaim, and these 2 works will both, I believe, be a very great help to students who are wishing to understand the form of the letters. And with that, today, let us turn to the form of the letter Aleph, the starting point of the alphabet. The form of the letter Aleph, the first of the 22 letters. Well, the Aleph is actually a composite of other letters. The Aleph is actually made up of the diagonal, and the diagonal has above it a Yud, and beneath it there is also a Yud. And both of these 2 yuds that are attached to the diagonal are standing upright. The upper yud is angled upright, as we shall see in a moment. The lower yud is standing in its proper direction, and it has a tug, a crown, which is attaching it to the diagonal. So what we have here, essentially, the diagonal is really a simplified form of the Hebrew letter Vav. The Hebrew letter Vav, the sixth letter of the alphabet, has this form of a makel, a rod, with a rosh, a head, and the head of the Vav is actually like the head of a Yud, except that the head of the Vav has this makel, this leg, extending all the way from the top of the line down to the bottom of the line. So what we see in the letter Aleph really is the combination of the Yud coming twice over above the diagonal and below the diagonal, and the Vav is represented in the form of the diagonal itself. We shall be seeing presently how there are certain rules governing how the diagonal line is supposed to look. But let us, before we go to that, simply dwell briefly on the significance of the form of the Aleph with these two Yuds above and below, and the diagonal. The diagonal represents what is called in Genesis chapter 1 the rokia, the firmament. It is something that divides between an upper level and a lower level. And this firmament is dividing between the upper Yud, which represents the concealed world. The letter Yud is the 10th letter of Aleph Bet, and since all of the letters have numerical values, the Yud being the 10th is the number 10. So the hidden world is represented in this Yud with the 10 sfirot of the hidden world, all of which are one. They're all contained in one essential blob of ink, this extended rosh, this head. And the diagonal is both separating but also connecting the upper world with the lower world. The lower world is a Yud, which is, as it were, mirroring and echoing and receiving from the upper Yud, and this lower Yud represents the lower world, our world, which is indeed all formed and created out of the hidden wisdom of the upper world. So we see how the letter Aleph is actually an expression of God's absolute unity, where he is above and below and is the one that connects above and below. And before we leave the matter of the significance of the actual elements of the Aleph metaphysically and Kabbalistically, let us just note that since the value of each Yud is 10, two of them together, that is 20, and with the Vav, which has the numerical value of 6, that is Gematria, the numerical total of 26, which is the same as the numerical value of the four letters of God's ineffable name, known as the Tetragrammaton, which is Yud K Vav K, where the Yud is 10, the two letters Hey twice 5, that is another 10, and the Vav is 26. Likewise, the Aleph is 26. So the Aleph really embodies the entire creation and the creator that causes the creation, and the name of the letter Aleph has the constituent letters of Aleph, Lamed, Pei. All of the letters of the Aleph Bet have names that are made up of other letters, because all of the letters are at root a unity, and the constituent letters of each individual letter's name are significance in the meaning and the value of that letter wherever it is. It always, even when we only see the Aleph on the page, the actual shape of the Aleph includes the hidden Lamed and Pei that make up the name Aleph. So the word Aleph, if you change around the Hebrew letters, you get the word Pele, a wonder. And indeed, the wonder is how the hidden, concealed world is indeed in unity with the revealed world. That is the wonder of two opposites, concealed and revealed, that are reconciled by the connecting diagonal representing God's presence from top to bottom. Well, now with that, let us come to the laws governing how the letter Aleph is to be written as they're brought down by the Mishnat Sofrim of Chafetz Chaim. He tells us the first law is that the upper right-hand head should be written similar to the shape of a yud, and it should have a small oketz placed on it. The oketz, that is the point. The Hebrew word oketz is a thorn, and as we shall see, all of the letters have thorns pointing in different direction. It's not that it is a pricky thorn, it is that there is a suggestion of a spiritual emanation that is going out from the letter, pointing outwards and emanating forth like a stream of light. So here the thorn on the top of the upper head, the yud, is indicating that the whole yud itself is an emanation that comes out of a line, the kotz, the thorn that comes out of nothingness. Sometimes the upper thorn is also called a tag, as we shall see presently. There is a difference between a tag, a crown, and here a kotz. In the case of the lower yud, this line joining the lower yud to the diagonal, this is really called a tag, a crown. Some of the letters have both thorns and crowns, as we shall see. For the moment, let us just note that according to the halakha, this yud, which is above the diagonal, is to be angled slightly upwards. It is looking upwards. The Hebrew letters are written from right to left. The scribe actually starts off on the left and draws the pen towards himself, but as the letter comes forth from right to the left-hand side, that is called the face of the letter. And any part of the letter also has a face. The yud, the part that emanates from the right, comes forth to the left. So this is the face of the yud. The face of the yud is looking upwards. It has this kind of antenna that is receiving energy from above, and the face of the upper concealed world is receiving from the high unitary source that we cannot even put a name to, Ein Sof. The letter is a constriction of the light. It's black light on white light. The surrounding page, the white, is what actually defines the letter, and the surrounding white is Ein Sof, infinite, and the constriction, the tzimtzum, the contraction, is when the letter appears in black, and its shape going from right to left with its face and its back. It's both looking forward and upwards. Now, continuing with the laws, when it comes to the lower end of the diagonal, the lower end must also be looking upwards. In other words, there's this kind of thorn at the bottom of the diagonal on its if it was standing upright, it would be its right-hand side. Again, it's looking upwards. We shall see in other letters that sometimes the back of the letter is looking back to its source of emanation. So I missed out when we were talking about the upper yud. I'm sorry. The very important second letter, a crucial law that the leg of the yud must be connected to the diagonal at its center. And given that the Yud is alluding to the upper world, it is actually injecting its emanation bang into the middle of the connector that spans from top to bottom, and the upper Yud must be connected. If the scribe, in writing the separate elements of the letter, the diagonal, and then the upper Yud and then the lower Yud, if he left a gap between the upper Yud and the diagonal, the letter would be pasul, it would be invalid, and a Sefer Torah that had such a letter, or a mezuzah, or a scroll of the tefillin, one of the klafim, the parchment of the tefillin, that had an Aleph where the Yud was not attached to the diagonal, that would be pasul. We see that everything, all the elements of the unity must be interconnected. Well, now we come to the lower head of the Aleph. Again, it is written in the shape of a Yud, and it has an oketz, a thorn protruding downwards. Here we see that this Yud, the lower head, the lower Yud, is not written at an angle like the upper head. This is written more or less like a regular Yud, but what is happening here is that the Yud is extending downwards with its oketz on its right hand base, and it is connected to the diagonal by the extension of the tag, this crown, by means of which it is suspended from the diagonal line of the Aleph. Now there is a law governing the distance that the lower Yud should be from the diagonal. We see here that at this point the text introduces a crucial concept, that is of the kulamus. The kulamus means the pen or the nib of the scribe, and the width of the nib of the pen of the scribe is used to determine the actual height of the letter. Here we see in this example, we are seeing how the letter is actually written artificially slimmer than it would be in a regular Torah scroll. This is in order to illustrate certain halachot, and here the halacha is that the distance between the lower rosh, the lower head, and the diagonal should be 1.5 kulamusim, 1.5 thicknesses, breadths of the line of the pen as at its broadest. So the entire height of the Aleph is to be actually from top to bottom 3 kalamusim, 3 breadths of the pen, and the distance between the top of the Yud and the top and the left of the upper diagonal should be 1.5 kulamusim. Well, now the next law is that there's a slight difference between the Bet Yosef script, the script of Rabbi Yosef Karo's halachic decisions, and that of Ari. And that is in exactly what we do have in the lower part of the Aleph. We've spoken until now of the lower part of the Aleph being a Yud. However, in Ktav Ari, the lower part of the Aleph is to be written like a dalet. Here we see illustration of the lower element of the Aleph, the left-hand lower element. According to the scripture, the Ari, you will see that there is it's an upside-down dalet. That is to say, we shall be examining the letter dalet in coming session, but the difference between a yud and a dalet is that the yud has a rounded corner. It has no corner at all, whereas the dalet has a protrusion outside of the vav, the leg on which it's standing. So that is a difference between Ktav Ari and Ktav Bes Yosef. And when we see the lower head as a Dalet, you have, going back to the values of the elements of the Aleph, the Yud, the upper Yud, that is 10, the Vov is 6, the Dalet is 4, that's a total of 20. Well, 20 is the letter Chaf, which comes after Yud in the alphabet and is also the initial letter of the word Keter, the crown. And when the Aleph is seen as a Yud, Vov, and a Dalet, it's really all one emanation from the Yud, because the Vov and the Dalet are constituent parts of the letter Yud. They are parts of its name. The letter Yud has the name Yud, that is spelled Yud, Vov, Dalet. So the Aleph, therefore, is the same as the Yud. It's all a unity. So that is the version of Ari of the writing of Aleph. To go back now to the laws of the letters that are common to both of the traditions. The oketz, the upper thorn of the Yud, should be as far as possible aligned to the bottom oketz of the Yud. This is a hidur, a beautification, where it's possible to do this. There should be a relationship spatially between the upper thorn, the kotz looking upwards, and the lower thorn of the lower head, the kotz looking downwards. Well, now, the Mishnat Sofrim states at this point that all of the above is taken from the work of the Bet Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Karo, on the letters. And the Mishnat Sofrim adds now that the Bet Yosef does not mention the lower kotz, the lower thorn of the upper head. This is not mentioned in those laws by Bet Yosef. However, according to another of the great commentators on Shulchan Aruch, the Pri Megadim, there should be an oketz, a thorn on the lower part of the upper head, just like there is on a regular Yud. A regular Yud has a very distinct upper tag, but it also has at the left side of the rosh, the head, a distinct kotz, a thorn besides the right-hand kotz that is extending downwards. So according to Pri Megadim, the Aleph should melchatchila, that is to say, when the letter is written from the outset as it should be, it should have this kotz. If this was absent from the Aleph, that would not actually render the Aleph pasul. Well, now, the next law is very important and relates to the way that the upper and lower yuds are attached to the diagonal. The line that is attaching the rosh, the head, to the diagonal must be narrow. If the line were too thick, the head would cease to be recognizable as a yud, and it would look more like a kind of pole sticking out, and that would be forbidden. So here on our screen, we see what would be the effect of the line joining the yud to the diagonal became too thick. It would be sticking out like a pole, and that is not recognizable as a yud, and that renders the letter pasul. Now, the same law that is mentioned here applies to a number of other letters where there are also yuds which are arranged in relation to other lines of the letters. Let us look at some of these different letters that do have are made up of a yud attached to another part of the letter as part of the letter. One example would be the form of here we have on screen now a letter tzadik. This is a letter tzadik as it is written at the end of the word. This is made up of a zayin together with a yud attached to it. Again, if the line attaching the yud were too thick, that would render this letter posel, invalid. The same with tzadik as it appears in the middle of a word. If the line attaching the yud, here the yud is facing backwards, if the line was too thick, that would render the letter invalid. The same with the heads of the shin, the heads of the letter shin. If the lines were too thick and the letters were, the constituents were not recognizable as what they are, which is the form of the letter vov, angled, then the writing of the letter would be invalid. And likewise, we have the letter pei. The letter pei is made up of basically a letter chof with an inverted yud that is attached to the roof of the pei. Again, if the line attaching the yud to the upper roof were too thick, that would render the letter to be pasul. Now, the concluding halachot relating to the letter Aleph refer to the way that the scribe actually would be writing these letters as he's writing a Torah scroll or tefillin or mezuzah. In the writing of a Torah scroll, if the scribe has made an error in the writing of one of the letters and he had not noticed it, even though he may have written a good part of the scroll, once the mistake is discovered, that letter may be corrected. It may be corrected in a number of different ways, subject to the halachot of how the letters are to be written and corrected, but the principle is that it may be corrected. That is not the case with the scrolls of the mezuzah or the tefillin. The Torah writes, "V'hayu letotafos bein enecho." They shall be for totafot, for an adornment between your eyes. V'hayu, the Hebrew word v'hayu is darashed and explained by our sages. V'hayu b'havayoson, in their way of being. That is to say that the letters of the portions written in the tefillin parchments have to be written one after another by the scribe correctly. And if he made an error in an earlier letter, he cannot anymore correct it. The same applies to the mezuzah. The letters have to be written correctly in order. And therefore, the last laws here that the Mishnah Tzofrim writes on the form of the letter Aleph is that if the scribe had written the Aleph wrongly, in the sense that he had made the line between the upper yud and the diagonal too thick, then he would be allowed to correct that as long as he had not got any further. If he saw that he'd written the Aleph incorrectly, the line of the one of the Yuds was too thick, and he'd not written another letter in tefillin or mezuzah, he may correct that letter. He may erase what he may do, he may add more ink to make the head of the Yud more prominent. However, if, as I said, if he had already gone forward in the writing of the mezuzah or the tefillin and had not noticed the error, he would not be allowed to go back and correct that letter. He'd have to take a new scroll and write the new portion. And there is a whole section of the laws of the writing of the letters that does relate to the different kinds of factors that may invalidate the writing of the form of a particular letter. And as we've noted already, and this is the concluding law of the Mishnat Chasidim, Mishnat Sofrim here, the concluding law is that, as we've noted already, if either the upper or the lower yud was separated from the diagonal, the letter would be invalid. So then now we conclude our study today of the Hebrew letters. We'll have just a very brief interval and come back shortly to some words from Rabbi Nachman on discovering the hidden light. Shalom again, and back to our studies now today, coming to the study of teachings from Rabbi Nachman of Breslev from his master work Likutei Moharan, the collected teachings of Moharan Morenu Rabbi Nachman of Breslev. And we are coming to study the teaching that is placed in teaching 15, lesson 15 of the first part of Likutei Moharan, known as the Or HaGanuz, the hidden light, which explains to us the meaning of the verse in Exodus of the calling of Israel to be a nation of priests and a precious treasure to the Almighty. And before we enter our study of this teaching, I would like to explain why I've chosen this. But for the benefit of those who will want to hear this later on, let me just start our audio recording as well. Shalom. Today, the 6th day of the month of Elul of the year 5777. Let's do that again also. Shalom. Today, the 6th day of the month of Elul of the year 5777, corresponding to the 28th of August of the year 2017, and we turn now to our study of Rabbi Nachman's teaching in Likutei Moharan, part 1, teaching 15, Or HaGanuz, the hidden light, a teaching based upon the verse, "You shall be for me a kingdom of priests," and a teaching that explains to us some of the mysteries of prayer. And my choice of this teaching for our study now in the season of Elul, as we prepare for the days of Or, starting with Rosh Hashanah, the coming New Year, on Wednesday night, the 20th of September, it's a time for introspection, for cheshbon nefesh, for the careful examination of our soul, spiritual accounting and bookkeeping, and weighing up our deeds and our actions. And this indeed is the very centerpiece of this teaching. And indeed, in one of the great commentaries on Likutei Moharan, one of the classic commentaries known as the Biur HaLikutim, the explanation of the Likutim, the teachings of Rabbi Nachman, by Rabbi Avraham, the son of Rabbi Nachman of Tulchin. Rabbi Nachman of Tulchin was a student of Rabbi Nachman of Breslav's foremost student, Rabbi Nosson of Breslav, Nathan of Breslav, and Rabbi Nosson had a disciple known as Rabbi Nachman of the town of Tulchin, and Rabbi Nachman of Tulchin's son, known as Rabbi Avraham, the son of Nachman, was one of the outstanding luminaries, a gaon, a shining light of the Breslav Hasidic teachings. And in his commentary on the Likutei Moharan, Biur HaLikutim, he begins his commentary on this teaching in Siman Tetvav, teaching 15 in Likutei Moharan, Or HaGanuz, the hidden light. One time, Rabbi Natan delivered an explanation of this teaching in front of an assembly of the Breslaver Hasidim, of the teaching of Or HaGanuz, the hidden light, which begins with the words, "One who wishes to taste the taste of the light that was hidden has to be engaged in judgment," that is to say, self-judgment. And that means hitbodedut, the practice advocated by Rabbi Nachman of personal spiritual account-keeping and devotion, hitbodedut, literally isolation from others in order to perform the spiritual work. After Reb Nassan completed the saying of this lesson to the Breslav Hasidim assembled, he said to them that the basic bottom line of this whole teaching is the teaching of hitbodedut. In other words, it's well known that out of all of the teachings and pathways brought down to us by Rabbi Nachman, foremost among them is the practice of hitbodedut. Of course, Rabbi Nachman said the most important thing is to be besimcha, joyous all the time. But the only way you can attain that level is through much hitbodedut, through much personal introspection and prayer to God. And that is the very essence of this teaching. And let us, before going into the text of Likutei Moharan, to take a look at what Rabbi Nachman writes about this teaching in his Kitzur Likutei Moharan, the abbreviated Likutei Moharan, where at the request of Rabbi Nachman wrote an abbreviated précis of each of the teachings in Likutei Moharan, drawing out its practical bottom line without entering into the elaborate methods of learning of Midrash of the Rebbe in his original teachings. And here in the following paragraphs from the Kitzur Likutei Moharan, composed by Rabbi Natan as an abbreviated Likutei Moharan, on teaching 15, the hidden light, he says, the one who would taste the taste of the hidden light, that is to say, the secrets of the Torah that will be revealed in the future, must elevate the faculty of yir'ah, the attribute of awe and fear, to its root. We shall hear presently what that means. Everybody has something they're afraid of. But to elevate the attribute of fear to its root is to understand that the only one to be afraid of is God Almighty, not the villain, not the attacker, not the taxman, not the police, not anybody else except the Almighty. And if one fears anything else, the attribute of fear has fallen, and one has to elevate this, and this is done through mishpat, through judgment, that is to say, through itbodedut, through seclusion, and talking it out between oneself and the one who owns us, where one pours out one's heart before God and examines and judges him or herself over all of one's activities and engagements. And it's through this that the person is able to remove from themselves all of the fears and terrors and to elevate the fallen yir'ah, the fallen fear, out of its fall. Because when a person does not judge and examine themselves, that person is judged and examined from above. And then the din, the actual verdict, the actual judgment may come clothed in anything. Because anything in the world, any situation, any person, any being, anything can become an emissary of God to carry out the decree against this person. The decree has been decreed in the heavenly court. That is to say, the person may receive their penalty and the punishment through anything in the world. As we actually see from direct experience, that sometimes when somebody has some difficult situation and some suffering they go through, normally it can come about through some perfectly mild, light cause, which sets in motion a whole train of events through which this person has all of this suffering, through some small thing where it started. And one would never have imagined that through some small thing like this, such an illness or some other form of suffering could have developed, God forbid. But all this is because the law that is upon the person from above gets clothed in this situation, in this thing that happened, in order to carry out the destined judgment against that person, that which the person gets their deserts. And all of that is only when the person does not examine and judge themselves. However, when the person will judge him or herself on their own initiative, that actually is able to negate the decree that is against them from above, and then they have no need to be in fear or in terror of anything. Because the person's din, the person's verdict from above is no longer clothed in earthly matters, because the person has already nullified all of the judgments against him through carrying out his own process of self-judgment and coming to his own or her own conclusions about what they have to do in order to transcend the state that incurred these heavenly decrees against them. And thenceforth, the innate fear that every person has in them is no longer clothed in any external matter. There's no need for anything to be sent to the person in some external cloak to arouse the person, because the person himself is already, or herself, they're already aroused, and this is how the person is able to elevate the attribute, the faculty of innate fear up to its root, to God Almighty. That the person should have only fear and awe of God Almighty and not any other fear. And it is through this, as we see in the continuation of the teaching, that a person is able eventually to merit, to come to the hidden light. With that, my dear friends, we conclude for today our studies, and as I've noted, we'll be here again on Thursday, not anymore according to our previous timetable of having classes also on Wednesdays. Owing to the pressure of my schedule, we should be having our next class on Thursday and continuing then with our studies. With that, my dear friends, I'd like to wish you shalom from the holy city of Jerusalem, and look forward to having you again here, God willing, next time. Shalom from the holy city.